So it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker at this morning's programme, the Reverend Dr. Lucas Mix. And Dr. Mix is the project manager and co-director of ECLAS, standing for Equipping Christian Leaders in an Age of Science. And ECLAS has been for many years at the forefront of helping the church in the United Kingdom to come to better terms with science and to equip its leaders to address the challenges that science presents or appears to present for people both inside and outside the church. It has attracted serious funding to help seminaries and theological colleges also to provide resources and guidance to those entering ministry, as well as supporting scientists in congregations across the country. And so we're delighted that Lucas is one of our invited speakers at the Christians in Science conference because, as well as being theologically very well qualified, he's actually a priest in the Episcopal Church of the United States, but he also holds a PhD in biology from Harvard University. He's a consultant with NASA and continues to do research at the intersection of biology, philosophy, and theology. And you can find out more about him and his work on his blog. But there you'll discover that he really is what we might call a natural theologian. And we're looking forward to hearing him this morning as he speaks to us on the book of nature, what science can tell us about God. Dr. Mix.
Good morning. So I have a confession to start with. I am overeducated. I have done a doctorate and a master's, and I went to lots and lots of school. And the reason that I say that is this word natural theology, there's this idea that we can reason our way to God and that maybe the people who are better informed and better educated are closer. And I want to tell you, as someone who is very well educated, it doesn't really work that way. I am going to share with you some philosophy and theology and whatnot because I geek out about those things. I have done those things, and that is where I have found God. But it's not the only place to find God. So much of my talk today is going to be about natural theology as an opportunity for finding God rather than a way of proving the existence of God. Does that sound fair? So this is the distinction, I think, between knowledge and wisdom that Paul was talking about. So I want to start with a fairly simple question. How many of you think I have a mother? Excellent. Why do you think that I have a mother? Yes, Ruth. I'm alive, yes. People have mothers. So that was the easy one. We're going to go slightly harder now. How many of you think this is my mother? I wonder if any of you recognize this person. She was the mother of Alex P. Keaton on Family Ties when I was young. This was a very popular show. This is Meredith Baxter, lovely woman. She is not, in fact, my mother. What about this person? You don't know, but I'm going to say this is Susan Mix. This is, in fact, my mother. And there's this interesting thing because there's a difference between knowing that I have a mother and knowing who my mother is. And even once you know who my mother is, there may be things that you don't know about her. You might not have guessed that she is one of the senior practitioners of the Korean martial art of Hapkido in the world, and has many, many black belt students and loves to throw people, including her kids. Luckily, we love to be thrown as well. So there's a really important distinction here, I think, to be made between knowing that she exists, knowing who she is, and actually knowing her. And that's the tension that we're going to enter into when we start talking about God. So I want to suggest this very important distinction that we bear in mind throughout the talk about the cosmological argument, that there is a difference between knowledge about God and knowing God. Now, what do you think? I have an intuition here, but before I bias you, raise your hand if you think it is more important to know about God. Raise your hand if you think it's more important to know God. Awesome. We are on the same page here. So we're going to talk about some stuff in reason and in science that will tell us something about God, which is very interesting. And I want to suggest that that's a great opportunity to know God, but that we be careful not to confuse the two, because that confusion, I think, can actually alienate some people. And we'll come back to that, but one of the big issues will have to do with suffering and whether our knowledge about God addresses the issue of suffering, or whether we need to know God to deal with issues of suffering. All right. How many of you have heard of the cosmological argument? Quite a few. Now, there are different versions of this, but I'm going to give you a quick summary because Paul asked me to talk about the cosmological argument. In rough terms, the cosmological argument says that natural things have natural causes. So if I am a natural thing, and that's a whole other argument, but let's go ahead and say, insofar as I am a natural thing, I have a natural cause. What is that cause? Oh, come on, I've primed you for this. Parents. Nice. Now, there's all sorts of other causes, but in biology, we talk a lot about organisms, and organisms come from other similar organisms. This is a principle of biology from a long time ago. But it's also true of physics. We tend to think that energetic things have a source of their energy. It came from somewhere. Massive things have a source of their mass. And frequently, people will talk about, since Newton, a billiard ball universe or a mechanical universe, and you've got all of these atoms bouncing around against each other, and those individual atoms or those individual billiard balls have momentum, and they got the momentum from another billiard ball. So this seems, I think, pretty straightforward in physics and biology, and it's been pointed out that if all natural things have natural causes, then, well, the easiest thing to think of is an infinite regress of natural causes going back forever. And Aristotle, one of the first great thinkers in the tradition that we now think of as natural science, said, well, there's something really disturbing about an infinite chain of causes. You may have heard of this principle, parsimony, that a simpler explanation is better. Nothing is less causes. And so a lot of science. This is embarrassing. We can't have an infinite chain of causes, so there has to be some sort of different cause. So we have natural things that have natural causes, but there must also be something which is, in some sense, unnatural, which starts the whole process off. Now, I will admit, I find a supernatural cause, or an unmoved mover, somewhat embarrassing as a rational thinker. But the question for me was not, is there something fundamentally embarrassing about an unmoved mover? It's, is it less embarrassing than an infinite chain of causes? I don't know there's a good answer to that question. Interestingly, the founders of modern science and Aristotle tended to favor this one. Scientists needn't go there, but this is the general structure of the cosmological argument, that natural things have natural causes, and that there's some embarrassing boundary at the beginning there. And I guarantee all of you know the embarrassing boundary at the beginning of physics. What's it called? The Big Bang. Now, if you know your physics, or have had good popular physics, as I know many of you had, because we have great physics communication these days, then you know that the Big Bang is not an explosion. It is, well, if we sort of imagine everything going backwards in time, it's getting closer and closer together until our models break. And so the Big Bang is an understanding of the rapid expansion at the very beginning, before which we don't really understand what happened. Is the Big Bang proof of God? Probably not. Interestingly, the Big Bang was proposed by a Jesuit, as you may know, and Fred Hoyle said, that's absolutely ridiculous. We can't have the Big Bang because that would be proof of God, and I don't believe in God. It was much more complicated than that. But the interesting thing is the Big Bang tends not to be proof of God or proof against God, though it's been used in both ways. it is this boundary. There's a beginning beyond which the rules that we have now don't seem to work very well. And I want to suggest that's going to be an interesting place to look for God. It is an invitation, but maybe not a logical proof for the existence of God. Or, if I'm going to put a finer point on it, it's proof of something godlike, but it's not going to get us to the God of Israel or Jesus Christ. That will be something that we know as we know God, rather than something that we know about God. Make sense? Probably less familiar. Anyone here know what the embarrassing boundary condition at the beginning of biology is? The origin of life. Actually, the origin of life is that little bit before. The embarrassing boundary, like the Big Bang, is the last universal common ancestor, Luca. Evolution gets you from 2 organisms down to 1 or 2 species down to 1. But then once you get back to that first organism or that first species, we have a lot of trouble figuring out what's going on there. Doesn't mean something miraculous. I don't know what this word miracle means in the scientific sense. I know that miracle for me is evidence that there's something really interesting going on that suggests to me God's relationship with us. So there it's sort of miraculous, but not really, for my mind, in this 17th century natural theology sense of proof that someone who doesn't agree with me must believe in my God because of it. I've gone off into philosophy there. I apologize. We've got the beginning of biology, which is the origin of life, and it's this interesting, different thing, which is an invitation to know more. Because there's been much talk about this, some folks, including Stephen Hawking, have talked about the chain of causes as curved in some way. He talks about going back into the past and time curving together. You can curve it together in the future too, and you get this nice circular chain. And that solves the temporal cosmological question. That is, what was first? But there's sort of this deeper issue of why there's something at all. So I like to ask people, okay, great, we've got a pool table, you've got billiard balls running into each other. Great, but where did the table come from? So it's not just that historical question. That historical question is the easiest way to get into the cosmological argument, but I think there's something deeper there, which is a recognition that there's something weird about the universe, that it exists at all, and worse yet, that we can understand it. Okay, so that is the cosmological argument. If you want to know more about the cosmological argument, there's actually a lovely article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. You can dive in and explore it to your heart's content. I would recommend to any of you who really like to geek out about this, look at the article on Anselm's cosmological argument, because the Middle Ages, they thought very differently about things than we do, and it's not quite the same argument. I think it's better, but that's just me. Okay. So, moving on to science. Actually, before we get there, I'm going to tell a short story. E-Class has worked in the United Kingdom for the last 12 years now. We're very excited to be expanding internationally, and I have just gotten back from Kenya and St. Paul's University in Kenya, where we talked with our partners there about setting up E-Class Africa. And we're very excited about partnering with them for the next 5 years to work with their seminaries and their congregations and talk about how our context shapes the way we engage with science and science-engaged theology. And I had just given a talk, and the chaplain of the university, very senior, dignified Anglican cleric, said to me afterwards, "You seem very enthusiastic about science. You seem enthusiastic about science in the way people are enthusiastic about Christianity. That's concerning." So I had to think, how do I respond to this in a meaningful way? And what I said is, Christianity is an important part of that's true too. Science is a very important part of my Christianity. It is part of how I relate to God. And traditionally, it has been a part of Christianity. And so when I am evangelizing for knowing about the natural world in this way, I am also evangelizing for knowing about God and God's creation. And for me, the two go together hand in hand. I don't think this is true of every scientist. I don't think it's necessary for science. But for me, it's true, and it happens to be true historically for many scientists. So the historian in me is very interested in this, particularly in a 13th century debate. Have you heard of Thomas Aquinas? Cool. Very well-known Christian. So Thomas Aquinas, probably the best-known natural theologian. He says God, out of God's goodness in creation, limited God's self to behave rationally, such that God will not make a four-sided triangle. And that we can know that there's no such thing as a four-sided triangle because God is good that way. This was the constrained power of God, according to Aquinas. Now, he had a contemporary, William of Ockham. Have you heard of William of Ockham? Cool. Occam's razor, parsimony. Cool. So Occam said, no. God can do whatever God wants. And this was a really big debate in the day, whether God was limited in such a way that our reason could follow. Are you following me? Awesome. Okay. So 3 centuries later, this debate was recapitulated by Descartes and Gassendi. And Descartes said, well, I can know things just by thinking about them because I am participating in the mind of God. And Gassendi said, no. God is bigger than you. Don't tell God what God can and cannot do. And this, I'm going to claim, is the foundation of modern science. The resolution of those two arguments between Christian thinkers: God is gracious enough to behave regularly and understandably, and God is unconstrained by our expectations and our limited reason. Therefore, observation is required. We're going to put together some stuff about knowing the mind of God, but at the end of the day, you actually have to look at what God did in order to understand God's action in doing it. And to me, this is the key to modern science, why it works well, and why it's so much fun to do. Because it does seem, once again, miraculously, in this somewhat weak sense of, isn't it really cool, and what does it say about our relationship with God, that we can know stuff. As a philosopher, I have no idea how we know stuff. But it does seem we actually know stuff. And we know stuff by going around and poking things and having relationships with physical objects. If you like this argument and want to follow up on it, it is an argument by a woman by the name of Margaret Osler. She is a historian. She's not going to talk so much about the evangelical aspects of it as just the historical. How did these two pieces get put together philosophically? Really great book, Divine Will and the Mechanical Philosophy. We know that all of us possess knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Anyone who claims to know something does not yet have the necessary knowledge, but anyone who loves God is known by him. So this is coming back to how do we tie together knowledge about God and knowledge about creation with knowing God. I used to think this was philosophically very cleanly distinct. I don't know, I'm getting older and calmer, and there does seem to be some blurry bits in the middle. But for me, science has been an opportunity to get into those spaces where I can have a relationship with God. And so love would be my final goal, and knowledge is something which may contribute to love. And knowledge, when it's no longer contributing to love, well, I don't know, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not what I'm doing with my life. So science is something that I do because it's helping me do this other thing. So a classic example of awe and wonder in science, something that we've heard a lot about. I was talking with someone about it just this morning. And we have this lovely example from Psalm 19, as in Psalm 104. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. And being a scientist and a geek, I like to show this picture. I don't know how well you can see it from there. You know the James Webb Space Telescope, the one that went up fairly recently? It's got such good resolution that it took a picture of a galaxy, a distant galaxy, at such resolution that it could look at other galaxies through that galaxy. So this right here, I don't know how well you can see the big white star with little points on it? That's actually a star in Wolf-Lundmark-Malott galaxy. And all those little colored things, those are other galaxies behind that galaxy. So for me, this is a great example of just how tremendously large the universe is. It goes on and on and on. And if I have a relationship with God, that's a relationship not with a local God, but this God who made all of that. And what does it mean to have a relationship with a God who is the God of countless stars and galaxies? And this is really cool, and I get really excited about this. But after working particularly in evolutionary biology and talking with people, there's another side of awe. So I refer to this as awesome, but there's also just a little bit of awful. There's some people who are scared about the size of the universe. It's uncomfortable for them. And so we have this line from Job. How can a mortal be just before God? Who made the Bear and Orion, the Pleiades and the chambers of the south? Who does great things beyond understanding and marvelous things without number? Look, he passes by me and I do not see him. He moves on, but I do not perceive him. He snatches away. Who can stop him? Who will say to him, what are you doing? I watched a very moving video actually recently of Stephen Fry, who's a very ardent atheist. And he was very, very upset at the injustice of the universe. And he thought if there was a God, why would we not be horribly mad at this God? And I think we need to respect that in people. But for me, the important insight here is that the awe of God has not been an answer to the problem of suffering. The awe is what invites us to ask exactly this. What are you doing? We, with Job, cry out to the heavens, and we believe God has answered. But that answer is a personal thing. So we need to be careful not to jump from knowing we need to ask to saying that we know the answer and what that answer is. Science is not a replacement for Scripture, and it's not a replacement for a relationship with God. But I do think it is a valuable addition. Similarly, and much more commonly in biology, this is an ichneumoniid wasp. Has anyone heard of ichneumoniid wasps? Yeah, a few people. Why have you heard about these? Darwin was really upset. So these are nasty little things. It's worse than even Darwin knew. We know about wasps now, and they will land on a beetle, and they will put their stinger in the back of the beetle's neck, and they will actually steer the beetle using the beetle's neurons to bury themselves in the ground, and then they will plant eggs inside, and the beetle remains alive while those eggs hatch and grow out. Because it's better for the offspring if the beetle is still alive when it eats them. That is not happy. So, we need to be very careful with natural theology and our arguments about providence, because there's lots of things we can look at that are upsetting to us as well. And if we believe God made the universe with all these things in it, then we need to have some sort of relationship with God to understand the significance of that. And I'm not convinced that I do yet, because I'm still upset about suffering. Are you upset about suffering? There's nothing in Christianity that says we should not be upset about suffering. What we have said, and what I think God has said, is that that is something we bring before God, and that God has suffered with us, and that we are there together, and it is something that we move forward in. And so once again, we have seen that science has told us something very interesting about the universe, and it has invited us into this relationship with God, but it has not been a replacement for that relationship with God. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made, so they are without excuse. Romans. I think the argument that Paul is making here is not that the natural world tells us exactly how things should be, therefore, if you don't follow that, you are wrong. But the natural world has shown us that there is something unknown, the unknown God, that we have this opportunity to have relationship with, and that in Christ we have named that unknown God. So, both observation and pure reason, getting back to Occam and Aquinas, provide knowledge about God. They provide reasons to look for the answer, but they are not the answer itself. Knowledge of God is the answer. I feel tremendously lucky that in going to science, I have found God. I feel tremendously lucky every Sunday when I go to church that I find God there. But I don't think that God is constrained to show up in church. It is that I go and find that God is there. And when I go to biology, even entomology, I find that God is there wondrously and mysteriously. So if you want to know more about me, I sort of lay out my thoughts about how people think in science and religion in this book, Thinking Fair. Check out eclassproject.org. We're doing all sorts of cool things all around the world now. I get truly pumped about this. I wish I had time to talk about it. But I will say that all around the UK and now all around the world, we are talking with people who are engaged in science and who are engaged in theology and who are engaged in the church and are doing this work of solving problems by using stuff from science and using stuff from theology and putting them together. And it's something actually I think we'll hear some from our later speakers about precisely that. How we practically bring our love of God and our knowledge of the universe together in responding to the suffering of the world. And maybe God responding to the suffering of the world through us. Thank you so much. It is a great honor to be with you this morning, and I think we have some time for questions.
Thank you, Lucas, especially for not ducking the hard questions. And perhaps we'll have a few more hard questions. If you'd like to ask a question, you're here present, just raise your hand, and Mary with the roving mic will go to you. If you're online and would like to have a question, fire away, and we will be able to bring that question through to us from Steph at the back. So we have a question from Peter at the front here. Oh, sorry, right.
Hi, I'm on. Yes, okay. Stephen, if you just ask your question.
Okay, I was going to ask about why Darwin chose the title for his book, The Origin of Species, when it's really the origin of species from other species. Does anyone have any ideas on that?
I think he's making an argument against the idea that species are eternal, and therefore he's focusing on that awkward question of the beginning of the species. I think, and this is a hotly debated question, Darwin early on basically says species individually don't need God to create them the way individuals don't need God to create them as bodies, but the origin of life does need God. Later in his life, he's going to be more squishy about that.
Thank you. Yes. Do you think science can distinguish between a deistic and a theistic concept of God?
So a deistic sort of being there is something that made the universe, and theistic being that there is a personal God. Science doesn't do persons. So I would say no, and I would say specifically because when Francis Bacon and others are putting together science, they're trying to avoid some difficult questions of the day, because there's lots of people killing each other about God at the time, you may remember. And there's some people, and they said, there should be some knowledge we can have without getting into those tough ones. And so Francis Bacon is explicitly going to include persons and God, not because he doesn't think they exist, but because he wants a way of reasoning that avoids those tough questions. And so I think, for my money, when science is done well, it's done well because it is methodologically limited. These are the questions we're going to tackle, and personhood is one that we're not going to tackle. Now, I talked about the Big Bang. The Big Bang is not an excuse not to push on that boundary. It is a recognition of the boundary. So, similarly with personhood, I am delighted to see neurological research that tells us more about what we think of as personhood and what we think of as free will. It's just that there's an understanding there that there's some things that we really want to reason about that we're going to probably have to approach from other angles as well. So if science somehow does produce information on that, great! I'm just not expecting it.
Another question from Zachary first, and then on the front here.
Great.
Zachary.
Thank you, Lucas. I really enjoyed that and think natural theology is really important. I wondered, you mentioned the origin of life is kind of analogous to the Big Bang in some way, both of them being invitations to think about God. Could you talk through that a bit more? Why would you say the origin of life might be particularly kind of helpful for as an invitation as opposed to some other kind of arbitrary scientific area? Is there something special about the origin of life, and what do you think about that?
I think there is. I've written a couple books on what life means, and it's a very complex topic, but I think one of the simple ones for me is that if I have a rock and I put it down on the table and go away and come back, it's still the same rock. But if I have something that's alive and I put it down on the table and I go and come back, it's going to be different and it might not be there. And that's weird. Like that, it's not just that it's sort of philosophically weird, it's that I can have a relationship with something that changes in that way, in a way that I can't have a relationship with something that doesn't. And my relationships with other living things, not just humans, but animals and even plants, is a really important part of my life. See it, I've used this word life, because there's something about me that changes in response to these other things changing. And so, I don't know, how many physics metaphors are there in the Bible?
How many?
Yeah.
How many, sorry?
Physics metaphors are there in the
Physics
Bible?
metaphors. Well, quite a lot, actually, in a sense. If you think of how God is described as acting in the world, in the psalm we read, he's clothed in light. There's intimations of his nature there, and riding on the wind and all those sorts of things. Those are metaphorical.
Excellent.
Yeah.
How many biology metaphors are there in the Bible?
You have to ask a biologist that one.
The bread of life, the vine and the branches, eating, childhood, no offense to the physicists, but I think there's more biology in there than there is physics. Like, this is an important part of how we identify ourselves and how we identify with God. And the physics is important too, but I'm a biologist, so I'm going to be biased. So yeah, I think there's something important about value and something important about life that just grabs us. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I wasn't expecting to get asked questions up here. One more
Okay,
question.
yes, thank you very much, by the way, for an eloquent and insightful presentation. I guess I might, as a physicist, of course, say that all biology and chemistry is actually dependent ultimately on physics, but we won't go into that. So.
There is a belief that there was a time when there was no biology, and then there was biology. And that's a current popular belief, and I'll pretty much buy into that. That's not, however, a scientific belief.
No,
that is
it's not entirely mine either. Actually, my question was about the Maker and the Big Bang. I have read that the Catholic Church at the time and the Pope sort of welcomed this as being a sort of proof of God. And I wondered if that is the case, what that said about their faith at the time, in your view.
I can't speak to that specific question. I can say Descartes and others came up with this idea of a mechanical universe. And they really did say mechanical universe is proof that there was a mechanic who made that universe. And so this was a move that natural theology made in the 17th century. I think it was a very bad move. And I think it was a bad move because it said, we can be Christians because science tells us we can be Christians. That's putting your faith in science instead of putting your faith directly in God or in Scripture. And so I think that's always going to be a bad move to say that science proves God, because science moves. Why does science move? Because God moves. God says, follow me. God says, knock. And so science is something which is dynamic, and we want to be careful to put our relationship in the person, in our knowledge of God, and not our knowledge about God.
Thank you, Lucas. We have time for one question from online.
Yeah, we've got a question from Jeremy online saying, you talk about an infinite regress or a beginning, but what about the idea that God is constantly creating all that exists, that we are dependent all the time on God? The regress of any sort tends to undermine this insight.
I think there are two types of regression and therefore two types of ontological argument. So the temporal, it's not quite the ontological argument, it's the cosmological argument, but anyway. If we're asking strictly what happened first, then I would agree with you. But when I talked about that circle up there and the question of why there's something rather than nothing, that's, I think, the interesting argument. So we're asking how it is that something happens, not just what was the historical cause. And the proper, to my mind, cosmological argument is, why does causation even happen? So I'm not just asking the historical question, I'm asking this sort of deeper question of what upholds physical causality and existence in the first place.
Thank you, Lucas. I think probably time to bring this session to a close, and thank Lucas again for a very stimulating and informative talk. Thank you, Lucas.